All right, let's talk about how to pick a recording studio if you're a band or a musical artist. All right, so I feel like this is a relevant topic because every so often some of the things on this list come up when I'm talking with clients and people don't seem to realize them or it hasn't occurred to them. And I think part of why that is because they just, a lot of people that are artists, they don't spend a ton of time in a recording studio. And so for those of us that are studio rats or have been studio rats at some point, these things might seem very obvious to us, but it's not to everyone else. So that's kind of why I'm making this video. So I'm going to have a list here that I'm going to go through, and it's just things to check or ask or look for when you're trying to select a studio to work in. And I don't really have any specific genre in mind with this, so it should be relevant across a range of genres, but let me know in the comments below if anything pops up or comes to mind that would be more genre specific. Okay, so number one is that you should be willing to travel. So sometimes the additional benefit that you would get from choosing a studio that's a good fit for you will outweigh the negative side of having to travel a little bit to get there. So be willing to at least consider it when you're looking at the studios that might be an option. You might want to kind of widen your net of where you're looking. So number two, what I'd recommend is taking a tour and looking and seeing if the studio is paying attention to detail. So look for things like, do they have hot water for singers available so they can make tea, stuff like that? Do they have tea? Do they have clean surfaces, or is everything dusty? I'm allergic to dust, so that would be a big problem for me, especially if I was a singer, right? Just make sure it's clean. Check if they have things like snacks or food menus to help you keep going during your session. And another thing to look at, and this might be something that you could ask about during a tour, you might not actually see this during a tour, but is whether or not they have built up easy booking and invoicing systems, how easy it is to figure that out. Like, for example, I'm on engineers, and if a client wants, they can just look and see what times are available on my calendar on engineers, and that'll tell them if I have that time available. They can then choose to book through me directly, or they can book through the system, but they don't even need to ask me if I have a certain time available. They can just go to the website and take a look themselves. And it doesn't have to be super fancy either. When I book someone, I will send them a Google Calendar invite with information on what we're working on and the location and stuff like that. So stuff like that really helps make sure that you're all communicating properly and everything's flowing nicely, and it shows a level of professionalism too. So I would check that and see what you notice. And so the third one, this is kind of related to number two because it involves visiting the studio. But instead of looking at the details of the studio, visit the studio, see the facilities, talk to the engineers, speak with people that work there, and see how the vibe feels. See if it feels like a good, comfortable space for you to exist in. Because if you're not comfortable with the engineer, you're not comfortable with the producer, you're not physically comfortable in that space, it's going to be really hard to get the outcome that you want with your music. That is an underrated feature of existing in a studio, is your comfort level. So make sure that you consider that, think about that. And a big part of that is the people, right? A big part of that is going to be the people. And, beyond that, if you do visit the studio and you have those conversations with the people that work at the studio, it's a great opportunity to discuss your project and ask any other questions that you might have in the process. So I definitely recommend doing that. Number four is a bit more technical, and it's to take a look at the gear and the equipment that is available at the studio and consider what you might have to bring yourself, what you might want to bring yourself, and what the studio can provide, because different studios are going to have different sets of equipment available, and some studios might have a million different amps for you to choose from, and some might not. And it might not be a deal breaker if the studio doesn't have a million amps for you to choose from, for example. But if you do want something specific and you don't have it yourself, it's good to just consider that and make sure that you check in with that before you book the time. So number five is maybe one of the ones that I talk to clients and my friends in the industry about maybe the most. And it's the idea that you want to check the experience and background of any engineer or producer that you might be working with in the studio. It's good to check that background, because just because someone's working in a commercial studio, for example, does not mean that they have significant level of experience or that they have a ton of experience. What I've noticed, at least in my city, and I'm sure there will be exceptions to this, but this is just what I've personally noticed, is that a lot of the people that are working in studios that are there all the time, they tend to be in the earlier stages of their career. And as people tend to get more experience and get more success, a lot of the time, what they do is they will build up their own studio in some kind of space, kind of like mine, right? Where it's a separate building, but it's on my property. It's like part of my house, but it's a separate building. So they'll build up some kind of a studio of their own, and then a lot of their clients will just see them in that studio instead of the big commercial studio. And there are a bunch of reasons for that, right? You can, for example, charge less to your client and keep more of it. That's a huge help. You have more control over the scheduling. You don't have a third party, which would be like the commercial studio that you have to work out the scheduling with. It's just, is my studio available? Am I available type of thing? And is the client available? So it's fewer parties to work out the scheduling with. It's easy to have this type of a commute, if it's your own space. There are a million different reasons for it. But I have noticed this pattern, and people who tend to get more experience in the industry often have that kind of a setup going on, and then they'll, as needed, go into the big commercial studios. Like, for example, I do that if I have to do like a big drum recording or piano, something that involves equipment that I don't have here. But that's honestly kind of rare, So most of my client work I'm doing here in this space. And I think people tend to see, someone's working in this studio, so they must be, higher up on the totem pole than the person that has like the big home studio, right? But it can be kind of deceptive. So what you want to do is you want to look at the actual experience and background of your engineer, because there are people with home studios with no experience in commercial studios who haven't learned from others, and they're going to have, it's harder to figure things out when you're not learning from others and you're not learning from people that have experienced success in this job. And then there are people with home studios that have multiple Grammys, so just check that experience. And, the other side of that is, and I've seen this happen a few times, is I've seen commercial studios bump up somebody for whatever reason to a job position when they have little to no experience. I'm talking like months of experience, right? Or something similar. So that's tough, because then they've been bumped up into this position, and now they're in some ways blocked from that assistant phase where you're learning from others that know what they're doing, that have this success. And it's tough because you don't know what you don't know. And so I would just check that background of whoever you're going to work with. And, for number 6, this aligns with the whole human capital side of things, kind of like with our last one, right? But it's the idea of checking any additional skill sets that your engineer or producer might have. So, for example, what instruments do they play? What are their specialties? What genres are their specialties? Do their specialties align with your needs and your goals? What style of music do you do, right? Does that align with what style of music they do? Just check with all that stuff. It helps. If you find someone whose specialty is your genre, that may have a much bigger impact than working with someone who specializes in a different genre. That might seem obvious, but it's worth checking, right? And then, for additional skills, if they play a whole range of instruments and they're willing to put down on your track, that might really help things. It might help you save money. It might help you save time. So it's good to check that stuff. Okay, so number 7 is to ask the money questions, right? So ask their rate, ask whether their rate includes an engineer. Sometimes a studio's rate does not include the engineer. So you want to make sure that you are asking the questions you need to ask to make sure that you are getting everything you need to get. Does it include mixing? Does it include mastering? Does it include an engineer? Do they recommend separate mastering? These are all interesting questions that you should ask, and then you will know exactly what kind of money you're on the hook for, right? And you'll be prepared for what to expect throughout the process. And then the other thing I would ask about, even if you're not going to take advantage of it, is whether or not the studio has flexibility. So, for example, with things like rates, are they willing to make a custom package for you? Are they willing to work with you depending on your needs? And if they're not willing to work with you on your needs, or they're not willing to adapt a package for you, then you might see resistance in other areas as well, and I would see that as some kind of a red flag. It's good if they're willing to be a little bit flexible to help you accomplish your goals, because if your goals are not their priority, then you might hit a stumbling block elsewhere as well. Number 9 is a simple one. I debated whether I even put this on here, but because it might be kind of obvious to some people, but it's the idea of, is the live room big enough for your purposes? This is kind of similar to the whole equipment thing. Do they have what you need? Number 10 is to check with the studio and see what additional resources they might have or have access to. So is there food readily available, whether that's ordering out or at the studio itself? Do they have lodging? This one comes up with studios, especially if it's more remote. And some studios have kind of like a retreat vibe, so you go and you stay there and you do, work on your music. And especially with that kind of studio, I would check and see what the deal is with the lodging or what they recommend for lodging. I would also ask about additional services, like do they provide marketing? Do they have video people, if you want to call them in, stuff like that. It's good to know about. Whether or not you use it, right? It's good to check and see. Number 11 is to check and see what their contract says. And I know a lot of studios do not have a contract. A lot of us do not always work with a contract, even if we have a contract. A lot of people are turned off by the idea of a contract. But the big idea here is, if they do have a contract, to see what it says. And then if they don't have a contract, ask if they're willing to put things down into writing, even if that's just in an email, right? But if they're not willing to put whatever the deal is that they verbally say to you down in writing, then I'd be a little concerned. Number 12, and this one comes up a lot with clients that are talking to me about bad experiences that they've had in the past with other studios, is the idea of asking, what happens if there's a technical issue during your session? Do you just eat the cost of that time, or will they comp you time? For example, if you're working with a visiting engineer, a good thing to ask would be whether or not there's an assistant there in the studio that can help you with routing and troubleshooting if something pops up, if something becomes a problem. And I don't know what the right answer is for a studio, but I have been lucky enough that I usually don't have technical difficulties in the studio. If something pops up and is a problem, I'm usually able to fix it within a minute or two. So I have not had to deal with this a ton, but I have had a couple cases where it's like, oh, I need to get a new cable, or I need to do XYZ. That's going to take me some time. And what I then do is I ask if we can reschedule the session, and I give them the session again, basically. Usually if it's something like that, though, that pops up at the beginning of the session. It's not like in the middle of the session that tends to happen. Okay, hi, it's Editing Cato here. Just a quick pause. I want to add that this has only happened to me once in the past 5 years or so, probably even longer. I just, recent memory type of thing. And that gives you an idea of how infrequent a thing it is. And actually, the one time that it did happen, that I did have to actually cancel and then reschedule the session, was when I first moved into this physical location and I was still getting it set up. And it was actually like a test session with a friend who is also a client. So we kind of knew that this might be a thing. And the thing popped up, it was like a specific cable that I had to go get that had busted. And I don't know if it was because of the move that it busted or because it was, ready to go. But what I ended up having to do is go buy a new cable. And when I did that, I bought extra cables. So now whenever this has come up with a session since then, I have had the spare cable ready to go, and it has not been a problem. I figured it out before the client even gets here, type of thing, and then I replace it. So that just gives you an idea of what it's like when someone has been trained on how to handle troubleshooting issues. And luck does come into it, but there are things you can do to improve your luck. Okay, back to the video. So that's how I tend to approach things. But I have heard horror stories from people who often don't have a very big budget, right? And they can't afford to have this happen to them. And the engineer doesn't know how to troubleshoot whatever's happening. And they lose a bunch of time that they paid for. And I think that's awful. I would never want to do that to a client. I think sometimes when studios do that, it maybe comes from a place of, desperation. They have to make ends meet. And I think that to some extent, there's a level of bullying to it. It's like, oh, well, this is just, they'll be like, oh, well, this is just something that happens. Like, technology, ooh, who knows, like this happens. This is part of the thing that happens. And it's like, no, professional studios will not be constantly, fixing things during your time instead of having things run smoothly. Usually it should be very, very smooth. It should be a smooth experience. You should not be paying for someone to try to fix things. And that's my little soapbox. I don't know. Maybe someone will fight with me in the comments about it, but okay, let's move on to number 13. So number 13 is simple. It's to ask whether or not setup time is included within your session time, setup, and then also breakdown strike. So if that is something that they do ahead of time for you before your session starts, versus during your session. That's going to have a very different impact on how you're going to want to book time, how much you're going to expect to pay, right? Setup time can take a lot of time. And the standard is for setup time to be during your session. But sometimes for things like, and you'll have to ask the studio to see what it is, right? But if someone's booking like a full day session, I will often try to get the setup going or started before the person shows up. And I think a lot of studios will also do that, right? And that's just to save them a little time, give you a little bit of added value where we can. So it's something to ask about whether or not that's included, what the expectations should be for that. Number 14 is something that I think a lot of people are probably already doing, but that's to check for things like reviews, testimonials, endorsements, talk to other musicians that you know in your area and ask them who they're working with, how they like their experience with whoever they're working with. Word of mouth can give you a lot of information that you would not otherwise have access to, and checking things like reviews and testimonials that can help you understand who has credibility, who's pissing people off, and who is delivering results consistently. And it's worth asking about, it's worth looking into. And the other thing with that is, if you can, to ask musicians that are in the same genre as you about who they're working with and what their experience is like, because a lot of the stuff can be very genre specific, right? And that's it. That's my list. I'm going to have a number 15 here, a final one, and that is to trust your gut. You want to be comfortable wherever you're working. That's so important with something like music. So just trust your gut on how it feels when you're looking into a studio. So that's all I have to say today. I hope someone out there finds this helpful. Let me know what you think in the comments below. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Check out my Patreon. It's patreon.com/CatoNoise. It helps keep my channel independent, which is very important to me. And I really appreciate my Patreon patrons, so thank you. And on the Patreon, we have a Discord server that we're hanging out on. That's been my main focus lately. I do also have some additional materials on my website for my Patreon patrons. We're running a book club on the Discord. It's been a lot of fun nerding out with everyone on there. So you can join for as little as $1 a month. So please check that out if you feel so inclined. And other than that, I come out with new videos every Wednesday. And thank you so much for hanging out. Okay. Who's pissing people off and who's pissing people off? Trust your gut. I'm kind of surprised at how often I hear about other studios where maybe the engineer is so focused on the technical that they're not working on making sure that the client's comfortable. And I think that's one of the things that might be one of the most underrated things that studios don't think about on the studio side. That is so important for your client to be comfortable. Yeah. I don't know. I hope everyone's doing well out there. I get to go see Ziggy Marley and the Wailers tonight, so I'm excited for that. That'll be fun. But before that, I have to get a bunch of work done, so I'm going to go. And I hope you're all doing well. Bye.